David Haye. Where did it all go wrong? David Haye is completely shot and over the hill at the age of 37. In fact, he may have been completely shot and over the hill before that. But in this video, I want to talk about why certain fighters age better than others. At 37, David Haye was shot, but yet you've got fighters like Floyd Mayweather and Vladimir Klitschko, etc., who were still very, very good at 37 and were still beating world-class opposition, despite the fact that both of them had a lot more fights than David Haye. But somehow David Haye was shot at 37 while those guys were still on top of the world. Why is that? I'm going to explore that a little later on in this video. But first of all, I want to make some amendments to what I said in my post-fight video. Now, all along in the build-up to this fight, I acknowledged the fact that David Haye was past his best, the fact that he was over the hill, the fact that we would never see the old Haymaker return. In fact, even before the first Bellew fight, I was saying that David Haye wasn't the same. If you go look at my post-fight videos for the Arnold Jurjai and Mark Demori fights, I was saying Haye's movement is weird. He doesn't look like he used to look. So I fully acknowledge that this was an over-the-hill Haymaker. But going by what I saw in the first fight, the fact that he survived 11 rounds on one leg and the fight was relatively close, I felt that in the rematch, David Haye, if he employed a safety-first game plan, he'd be able to win the fight on points. Even though he was over the hill, I felt if he stuck to a safety-first game plan, he'd be able to win the fight on points. Now, there were two groups of fans telling me that this was not going to happen, that Haye was never going to win this fight, that he was never going to be able to box a safety-first game plan for 12 rounds. The first group of fans were saying, Hatman, David Haye is far too egotistical, and he was far too humiliated in the first Tony Bellew fight to be going in there in the rematch, fighting safety first. He wants revenge. He wants a spectacular knockout. His ego will not accept anything else. And so therefore, forget about this safety first game plan you're talking about. David Haye's going to go for it. And he's either going to get knocked out or injured in the process of trying to knock Bellew out. So that's what one group of fans were saying. The other group of fans were saying, Hatman, David Haye cannot stick to this 12 round game plan, even if he wanted to, because he's going to get injured. His body can't go 12 rounds. He's too injury prone at this stage. Look at the fact that he had the Achilles injury in the first fight. Look at the fact that he had a bicep injury in training last year, late last year. He's not going to be less injury prone in the rematch. He's going to be even more injury prone. So even if he wanted to stick to a 12 round safety first game plan against Bellew in a rematch, his body will not allow him to pull it off. Now, one of those groups of fans was clearly correct. Either David Haye's ego didn't allow him to box safety first, or David Haye's body didn't allow him to box safety first. Maybe it was a combination of the two. Because watching a fight live, David Haye did quite well in the first couple rounds. Particularly the second round, which I thought he won clearly. And I couldn't understand why in the third round he went for the knockout. But Paulie Malignaggi noticed something in the very first round. He noticed that David Haye was putting all his weight on his front foot, which is something David Haye doesn't normally do, although in his comeback he has been doing it. But Malignaggi noticed he was doing it even more in this rematch. He was putting all his weight on his front foot. And by putting all his weight on his front foot, he can't get so much power in his right hand. And Malignaggi noticed he was doing this because he was probably protecting the right ankle, the Achilles that had ruptured in the previous fight. I didn't notice that when I watched the fight live. Paulie being at ringside, you can see the fighter's feet when you're sat at ringside, so it's easier to notice things like this. So I have to admit, I didn't pick that up, but some other people did, as well as Paulie. So looking at the fight retrospectively now, having watched it a couple more times, yeah, it's clear that David Haye probably knew he couldn't do the 12 rounds. And that's why he went for it in the third. He probably thought to himself, you know what? This ankle's never going to hold out like this for 12 rounds. This shoulder, the ankle, the bicep, something's going to go. That's probably what David Haye was thinking. Something is going to go at some stage. So the first opportunity I get to land a big punch, I need to take it with both hands. And that's what he did. And he paid for it. So again, both those sets of fans, or at least one of those sets of fans, were right. David Haye clearly didn't have what it takes to box the strategy which I had thought he would box, a 12-round safety first strategy. He just didn't have it in him to do it. Now, as far as David Haye's career and where it went wrong and why at 37 he was washed up while other fighters weren't, because again, David Haye has had relatively few fights. He hasn't even had 40 fights in his career. I think he's only had, 32, 33 fights? So, relatively low number of fights. And he hasn't been in many wars either, David Haye. Normally you associate guys who burn out early with with being in a lot of wars and whatnot. But David Haye was never in a lot of wars. So, why did his body break down so early relative to other people? Well, one of the reasons is because of the fact that David Haye was never a natural heavyweight. In fact, David Haye, and I used to say this years ago and people would scoff at me, but I used to train at the same amateur gym as David Haye, Fitzroy Lodge. I wasn't there at the same time as him. I was there just after he left. So people were still talking about David Haye because he had a fallout with Mick Carney, who's now dead, who was the head coach at Fitzroy Lodge. And so people were still talking about David Haye and whatnot because he was one of their best fighters at the time. And one thing about David Haye is from a very, very young age, he wanted to be world heavyweight champion. But he was a naturally slim guy, quite skinny actually. So as he progressed through his teenage years, when he was boxing as an amateur, it quickly dawned on David Haye that he was never going to be a natural heavyweight. So at a young age as a teenager, David Haye took matters into his own hands and he started lifting weights to try and gain size. If nature wasn't going to make him a heavyweight, he was going to take matters into his own hands and, force his body to become a heavyweight. And that's what he did. He started lifting all these incredibly heavy weights. And David Haye, even when he was 175 pounds as an amateur and, 180 pounds, he used to spar heavyweights, a lot of professional heavyweights. David Haye used to spar them. And I was told by people at Fitzroy Lodge that David Haye would try to knock out everybody he sparred with, particularly when he sparred with heavyweights. He would always try to knock them out. And this was David Haye trying to convince himself and others that he had what it takes to be world heavyweight champion. That's what it was all about from a psychological point of view. That's why he went so hard when he was in there sparring with heavyweights. He used to spar people like Danny Williams when Williams was a pro. He sparred Audley Harrison, obviously, and many other people. And he'd always try and knock them out. He even went to the lengths, from what I was told, of putting weights sometimes underneath his tracksuit bottoms or whatever for certain fights so that he could fight in a weight division higher than, he naturally would. So let's say he weighed 185 pounds, he would put weights, so let's say he weighed under 175 pounds, which is a light heavyweight. or I'm not sure exactly what light heavyweight is in the amateurs, but it's around 175. He would put weights in his pocket so he could weigh over that and therefore qualify to fight in a higher weight division. Because again, in South London vernacular, he was begging it. Yeah, that's a term we use when someone is trying to be something they're not. He was begging it. He was trying to act like he was a heavyweight when he wasn't really a heavyweight. So yeah, loads and loads of years of extremely heavy weightlifting to put on all this muscle, which his body wasn't naturally designed to carry. This put a tremendous strain on his tendons and his ligaments, doing all this incredibly heavy weightlifting to gain all this mass. It also put a strain on his heart and lungs, because when your body is not naturally designed to carry that much muscle, it strains your heart and lungs because they have to work extra hard. They have to work harder than they were designed to work to provide blood and oxygen for all this extra muscle. You know, a guy who is naturally 220 pounds at 6'3", their heart and lungs are designed to pump blood around a frame that big. David Haye's heart and lungs were not designed for that, which is one of the reasons that he always had stamina problems during his career. One of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons. So you've got the weightlifting, which impacted on his ligaments and tendons. You also had the fact that David Haye was always an intense fighter. He would train very intensely and he would fight very intensely. I've spoken about this many times before. When you look at David Haye's face when he's fighting, he always has almost like a grimace on his face when he's throwing punches, especially. He's grimacing. He's like really straining to get maximum power on every punch. He just trains in this, fights and trains in this extremely intense way, in a very high impact way. You know, he's not relaxed the way that he trains. Everything is intense with David Haye. And again, this puts a lot of strain on the body. And it's not just the fights. In fact, it's more the training camps which put more strain on the body rather than the actual fights. Because as I say, David Haye wasn't in a lot of wars or anything like that. But again, he was lifting far too much weights, straining his ligaments, training very intensely with fast bursts of energy and speed, always with a grimace on his face, always trying to eke out that extra bit of power in his punches for every single punch, for every single training session. This is how he trained. That puts strain on the body. When you have a more relaxed fighting style like a Mayweather or even like a Klitschko, who's a pretty relaxed guy in the ring, they train relaxed and they fight relaxed. And that is easier on the body. Whereas David Haye trains intense, he fights intense. You know, he trains in a strained manner and he fights in a strained manner. Something's going to give. Another reason is David Haye's style, that Roy Jones Jr.-esque type style, is a young man style. It's a style that relies on reflexes and speed. And as you age, your reflexes and speed diminish. So you need technical ability to fall back on. This is something Spencer Fearon also talked about. This is something which I've talked about many, many times over the years. This is something even Adam Booth talked about when he was training David Haye. Him and David Haye had an agreement that Haye would retire at the age of 30 because he had a young man's style which relied on speed and reflexes. And after the age of 30, those decrease, and therefore his style's not going to work anymore. So if you don't adapt your style and evolve your style as your reflexes slow and as you lose your speed, then you're going to get found out. And that's what happened to Roy Jones Jr. And that's ultimately also what happened to David Haye. That is a young man's style. Roy Jones Jr. was never particularly good technically. He got by on having incredible athleticism. David Haye, to a lesser degree, the same situation. He was never a spectacular fighter, technically. He was a guy who relied heavily on his speed, his punching power, and this Roy Jones ambush type style that he used. At 37 years old, it just don't work. I personally do think David Haye did try to adapt his style, Because when I saw him in the Domori fight, in the Jurjai fight, that was not the old David Haye. His style was different. He was more front foot heavy. But he was adapting his style not to become more technically proficient. He was adapting his style, in retrospect, to disguise injuries. That's why he adapted his style. And then lastly, people also talk about David Haye's lifestyle outside the ring. They say that he kind of lived a party life, especially in his 20s. And even though he was aesthetically in good shape, he used to drink. He used to, go out late at night, nightclubs and all these kind of things. This is one of the reasons people are given for him not having longevity. And there may be some truth to that, but I think the first two reasons are probably more significant than him going out late drinking and partying, because David Haye did fluctuate in weight in between fights, but not dramatically, not like a Tyson Fury, not like a Riddick Bowe, not even like a Ricky Hatton. David Haye wasn't putting on 5 stone in between fights. Sorry, let me just get this alarm here. Yeah, David Haye wasn't putting on 5 stone in between fights. He wasn't putting on 100 pounds or whatever. So, again, it might have been a contributing factor, but I think the weightlifting and the training methods were more of a contributing factor as to why David Haye broke down. His body broke down by 37, or earlier than that. Really, his body was breaking down from after the Chisora rematch, because he wanted to fight Tyson Fury, but he got injured and all that kind of stuff happened. And that's when he was, 33, 34 or something like that, during the whole Tyson Fury incident. Maybe a bit younger than that. So, some people, and I want to shout out to Kieran. He knows who he is. Shout out to Kieran. Kieran says that he wishes David Haye had never moved up to heavyweight. He wishes David Haye had stayed at cruiserweight. This is something I used to say back in the days. I think it was after Haye lost to Klitschko, I made a video saying I want David Haye to move back down to cruiserweight. I think he'd be a much better fighter at cruiserweight. Now, from a boxing perspective, I do think Haye's career would have panned out better. I mean, we don't know for sure, but I personally believe Haye's career would have panned out better for him if he stayed at cruiserweight. I think he wouldn't have had to do so many weights. I mean, even at cruiserweight, he was pumping a lot of weights, people. But he wouldn't have had to do so many weights. The fighters are smaller, so that when you're fighting someone who's twice the size of you, your training has to be more extreme because you're stepping into an extreme situation. At cruiserweight, he was fighting guys the same size as himself, pretty much. So I think his body wouldn't have been under so much strain in training, and he was just more effective at the weight. His power was more effective. He didn't have to deal with height and reach disadvantages, physical strength disadvantages, etc. And he could have gone on to be a long reigning cruiserweight champion. When he stepped up to heavyweight, his career took on a slight circus show element to it. At cruiserweight, he was fighting the elite guys. He was fighting Mormek, and he was fighting Enzo Maccarinelli and all these, other champions and whatnot, elite guys, and beating them. Whereas when he stepped up to heavyweight, he was a snake oil salesman. During Haye's reign as WBA regular champion, I was very critical of him. He was making out as though the Klitschko's were ducking him, and all along, if you guys who are long-time subscribers of mine might remember, I was saying, no, it's actually Haye ducking the Klitschko's. And I gained a reputation on YouTube for being a David Haye hater at the time. Again, those of you who are long-time subscribers who remember me from my old channel, you will confirm what I'm saying is true right now. That I was getting accused of being a David Haye hater because I kept saying this guy's ducking the Klitschko's, but he's a snake oil salesman. He's making out as though they're ducking him when it's blatantly not the case. So this was when he moved up to heavyweight. He started all these shenanigans. He started becoming a snake oil salesman. He started lying a lot, or a lot more than he used to. he was fighting people like Monty Barrett and making out as though Barrett was still a top contender. Then he fought John Ruiz, who was way over the hill, even though that was a mandatory. Even when he beat Valuev for the title, he was playing it up as though it was one of the greatest achievements in sporting history, you know. And Valuev was a guy who really and truly had already lost to a nearly 50-year-old Evander Holyfield, but got a gift decision. He'd already lost to Ruslan Chagayev, but David Haye was convincing the British public that what he'd done in beating Valuev was something amazing. And as I say, he ducked the Klitschko's for a long time. He actually was supposed to fight Vitali instead of fighting Valuev, but when a Valuev opportunity came up, he abandoned fighting Vitali and he went for Valuev. And then obviously there was the infamous Audley Harrison fight. So yeah, his career as a heavyweight was really about making money. It was never about being a true champion. Whereas at cruiserweight, it really was about being a true champion. And he was a true champion at cruiserweight. And if he'd stayed at that weight, again, he might have gone on to become one of the greatest cruiserweights ever and a long reigning champion, a credible champion. But from a monetary perspective, I can understand why he moved up to heavyweight. That's where all the money is, you know. So I can't blame him for moving up, because if he'd stayed at cruiserweight, he probably wouldn't be a household name in the UK. He probably wouldn't have fought in all the pay-per-views. You know, he might have had a lot more fights, but maybe a lot more damaging fights in the end. So I can understand where Kieran's coming from, saying he wishes David Haye would have stayed at cruiserweight. He would have been more credible, but he wouldn't have made as much money. So I guess there's value in both arguments, both for him going up to heavyweight and against. Anyway, let me know what you feel about everything I've talked about in this video. Where did it all go wrong for David Haye? Maybe some of you guys have got some other reasons, possible reasons why somebody like a David Haye is finished at 37, whereas guys like Mayweather and Klitschko have still got it at 37. So anyway, let me know how you feel about everything I've talked about in the video in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out.